Are we to gather only those who already agree with us? Are we sent out only as warriors of high conflict to fight for our side? Transformation is a lasting, sometimes permanent, important, substantial, profound change. Transformation is also the process of undergoing such a change. Transformation can happen in the blink of an eye. Sometimes that transformation is wonderful, good, positive, healing. First kiss, the birth of a child. The test results are negative. The acceptance letter to that college or job. The winning Powerball numbers are the ones on your ticket. Your team wins the championship. Sometimes transformation is horrible, traumatic. The test results are positive. The rejection letter from the college or job or lover. Your team loses the championship. The death of a child, partner, or loved one. I bet nearly everyone in the room can tell me where they were and what they were doing when you heard the news on December 14th, 2012 of what happened in Sandy Hook. Transformation can happen instantaneously. There's a line in the sand, a date on a calendar, a mark that separates the way it was before and the way it is now. If you have to think about what these transformative moments were in your own life, they were not that transformative. These lightning strike events are the ones we most associate when we hear the term transformation. And it's very apparent when these things happen that what's happening is for good or ill. But transformation is also a process, sometimes a very long, tedious, difficult process. Even after days, weeks, years, we're still not sure if it was for the good or for ill. Or worse, we still don't know who we are because of it, but we know it happened. Transformation is also a journey of becoming. Training for a job, athletic competition, mastering any skill, from cooking to a language, to gardening, playing an instrument, being a member of a community or a congregation. I believe that transformation is why congregations exist. I believe transformation is why faith communities exist, churches, congregations, temples, mosques, to transform human lives for the better, so that they can transform other lives and thus the world for the better. I think congregations have two essential and related functions that form the transformative cycle. These functions are simple: gathering and sending. Congregations gather people together for the purpose of transformation. Active participation in a congregation should transform you, should provide opportunities for education, inspiration, enrichment on many levels: spiritual, emotional, intellectual. Engaging the worship and educational opportunities and social life and activist opportunities provided by participating in a congregation will change you essentially, profoundly, especially over time. And you may not even be aware of it until you sit and contemplate that who you are now is different than who you were for the better because you're part of the congregation. Having been gathered and transformed, congregations send us into the world. And this happens on many levels, from the level of a family at home to young people and adults at school and work communities, and the way they live there. How people get involved in the world, from politics to caring about certain issues, to community projects, to being involved with institutions. Our involvement hopefully transforms all those things in which we participate and where we spend our lives. Congregations also transform the world by how we agree to be active together as a group, as a congregation, in the community and world around us. Transformed people transform other people. I think this is what Howard Thurman was getting at in his famous quote, "Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive." I think what he's getting there is the world needs people who have been transformed in such a way for the better that they are moved, called, invited, almost ordered to go change the world for the better in whatever way they can, however they can, wherever they can. And so that's what we do here. We gather and send. And if we're gathering and sending effectively, we are having a far greater impact on the world than we usually recognize at any one time. Because all of us, in whatever we're doing, are taking who we are because of our participation here and influencing everything that we're involved in and every relationship we have. My friend, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, writes in her blog, The Reverend Doctor, recently about visiting a friend in Pennsylvania last summer and going for a walk. And he took her on a walk by his church. And she says, "We walked past an unassuming sidewalk sign in front of its doors. I spun on my heels to look at it again. 'That's yours?' I asked, astounded. 'That?' he said, pointing to the sign. And the sign read simply, 'Peace to all who pass by.' 'Yes,' he said. I spoke to him in almost a near whisper, embarrassed, I suppose, to be talking shop while visiting him. 'It's a benediction.' He smiled at me. 'I know, it is,' he said conspiratorially. There was a growing lump in my throat. I wanted to weep. An unapologetic benediction outside in broad daylight on the street. She goes on to talk about that this reminded her of the wayside pulpit, which has largely disappeared from American life now, but once was a practice of churches and congregations of all types and denominations, where there was posted on a visible signboard a rotating series of inspirational quotes and messages. As she says, a non-sectarian gesture of goodwill to the wider public. And then she goes on to reflect that contrasts with her in a jarring way, that wayside pulpit goodwill, to the wider prevalence of what has become, as she sees it, echo chamber reinforcing declarations of protest posted from churches. that's kind of replaced the wayside pulpit. She says, I can't imagine the protest signs giving anyone the will to go on living when life seems to lose its meaning. I can't imagine them ministering to a lost soul looking for something. I wonder if congregations can be places of transformation if we're increasingly places for the already converted to our viewpoint and the people already on our side. Are we to gather only those who already agree with us? Are we sent out only as warriors of high conflict to fight for our side? I really believe that queer people should be welcomed and Black Lives Matter and hate shouldn't have a home anywhere. And science is real and we need to save the planet. I believe that everyone, for whatever and any and all reason, who feels unsafe in this world and around others, needs to have and deserves to have a place for their spirit and a place for their transformation that's free from the bigotry and hatred and discriminations they face in the everywhere else of their lives. So it's good we provide a gathering space for that. But I also am becoming increasingly convicted that we can't truly be a transformative place as a congregation if we are only an echo chamber, interested only in those already inside and those who are already on our side. My friend, the Reverend Dr. Murphy Mason, says she feels increasingly that Unitarian Universalism asks us to, quote, virtue signal without ceasing. Over the years, she says, we regularly and energetically demonize people we perceive to be in the opposition. It became incumbent upon us as a people of faith to tirelessly seek ways to identify and shame the haters. I'm not exactly sure if she's correct, but boy, does this make me think. We can't have a transformative effect on the world around us by mimicking the world around us. We have to be countercultural. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that the single greatest service a faith community can perform in America right now is to rehumanize and reconnect people. Not just liberal people, all people. I believe this increasingly, largely because of a series of transformation I've undergone in the last 8 to 10 years. It's a story of how I transformed into the monster I didn't like in order to feel safe from the monster I thought was threatening me. The rise of the MAGA movement has transformed me. And at first, not for the better. And I think it's transformed our society and not for the better. My transformation began as the presidential primaries drew to a horrible close in 2016. The final straw for me came when I found out that a guy I went to college with was one of them. This was a guy who I know had a college education. I was there. And he lived where I now live because he grew up in that town where I was now serving as a minister. He had once helped me organize letter writing campaigns and student protests and demonstrations for the human rights organization Amnesty International. And he was now wearing proudly around town a red Make America Great Again hat. How? Why? I had hoped when I began my ministry in that place that he and I might become closer friends. When I saw that, I gave up on it. I'm ashamed of that now. He was one of them. Them, the brainwashed, the ignorant, the gullible. They were not just misled, they were dangerous. The gullible, tricked by the unethical. History tells me that people like my college buddy fall under the spell, and then human rights disappear, and terror reigns, and atrocities happen, and democracy dies. I still shouldn't have let him go. Those people are a cult. They are stupid and evil. I wasn't sleeping well. I was afraid of them. I hated them. I walked out of offices, pizza places, and the gym because they wouldn't stop playing Fox News on the televisions. I got a new doctor, a new pizza place, and a new gym. Not that it helped. I began stress eating in earnest. I doom scrolled social media and news sites. I lost interest in virtually everything. I binged, rewatched The Sopranos, having awful fantasies about certain politicians getting whacked. I binge rewatched Game of Thrones, having awful fantasies about certain politicians being eaten by dogs, like Ramsay Bolton. Yeah, it was bad. That's the face I made at myself when I realized it. Whoa! Who was this person? What had I become? It terrified me, what I had become. What had happened to nonviolence? What happened to loving my enemies? What happened to just taking the side of love? What happened to doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God? What happened to me? What happened to me? I came to learn I was stuck in what's called the tar pit. I had fallen into the conflict trap. High conflict happened to me. I was an us, and I hated them. In her book, High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, which we heard from this morning, Amanda Ripley explains the difference between good, productive conflict, there is such a thing, and problematic, destructive, high conflict. She says that high conflict is all-consuming, self-perpetuating, marked by us versus them dehumanization, where the other side is beyond reason. It leads to zero-sum thinking, obsessing over the wrongs done by the other side, and tends to leave virtually everyone on any side worse off. There is, however, good conflict that engages communication, especially across difference, has productive back and forth discussion, does not dissolve into dehumanizing the other side. Eventually, by the winter and spring of 2017, I had unknowingly engaged two of the most effective techniques for breaking away and out of high conflict. I created space between me and the conflict. I realized I had to limit my intake of news. And for many, many months, probably a couple of years afterwards, I limited my news intake to clicking through the New York Times headlines over coffee in the morning and listening to NPR NewsHour while I made dinner at night. Any more than that, I shut it off. And that was still kind of a lot. And I found something else to engage me. I not only created space, but I found something else to engage my mind, myself, my activity. I got deeply involved in community service, not just as an activist, as a minister in the area, but I did things like I ran for the elected town meeting and won. The town I was living in was shocked when in 2017 its town meeting elections reversed the conservative town meeting to a much more liberal town meeting. Apparently other people were doing what I was doing. I got involved in community projects where I was working with people wearing the MAGA hats. I had reached what people who study high conflict call saturation point, when the conflict I was involved in was costing me so much it was no longer worth my participation. It was costing me myself, my values, my hope, my joy. I needed to stop and find a different way. It had transformed me into something I no longer recognized and knew was wrong. I didn't know what it was called yet, but I was looking for the fourth way, a way of dealing with the conflict beyond fight, flight, or freeze. Conflict is incredibly transformative. It both creates and destroys community. It creates community because nothing unites people more than a common enemy. A common enemy binds people into community. People turn to each other, rely on each other. But this is a shallow type of community. It's not really belonging. It's fitting into the side. Each side of a high conflict expects everyone on their side to hate the other side. That's how it works. We expect everyone to distrust the other side. That's how it works. Make fun of the other side. That's how it works. Cast the other side as the enemy, not only wrong, but evil. Dividing people requires nothing more than constant conflict pitting them against each other. It takes surprisingly little time for a conflict between people or groups to be about the conflict, not about the original issue that they had differences over, the root of the conflict. High conflict cannot create belonging. Belonging requires you to be your honest, authentic, and vulnerable self. Belonging requires accepting others just as they are. The high conflict of red and blue politics in our country negates building community. And it especially negates building community between and among and consisting of people of different political views. But democracy requires we remain engaged and connected and in community with people who have different opinions than ourselves. It can't work any other way. Good conflict is positively transformative because it's between those who belong to each other who actively seek to create belonging. High conflict is the opposite. It's destructive in its transformation because of its volatility and the way it encourages hate and violence and war. That's only harmful transformation. Conflict transformation and creating belonging is wholly sacred work. The leading tactic, as we learned in the reading, for doing this among the people who mediate conflict and study the mediation of conflict is contact theory. You've got to have personal contact with people who see it the other way. There are certain conditions, and the conditions are incredibly important. Participants must agree willingly to participate in such contact. And it's best if you don't just talk, but you do something together. Like, say we found a bunch of fundamentalists wearing MAGA hats to go serve at the soup kitchen together with. That would be much more effective than trying to have a mediated discussion with them in a circle. Most importantly, participants in the contact must agree to listen to each other without responding. And that's really difficult for anybody to do, even in a non-high conflict situation, because most of us are always thinking about what we're going to say to respond instead of just listening to somebody else. And it's even harder when what somebody else is saying is something that is so against everything you value and hold dear that you can barely restrain yourself. The poet and activist Padraig O once worked for an organization that brought together Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. And he writes about the process they used because it was centered on telling stories. Everyone has a story. And the process his group used was everyone had to listen to everybody else tell their story. And that rehumanized people enough to start seeing them as people again. Everyone has a story. They're human stories like your own. And when you dehumanize, you make the other less than human, you remove their story as valid because it's not a human story like yours is. And you can throw each other into the tar pits together. Or worse, you can start bombing each other and killing each other. Contact is a great tool. And contact activities work in rehumanizing the others to each other. But contact does not solve conflict. What it does is it creates the ground that makes solving the conflict possible. Step one. It depends on people being reachable. And one of the worst things high conflict does to us is it makes us truly believe that the vast majority of them are unreachable. And that's a lie. The reality is the exact opposite. The vast majority of the other in any high conflict situation are actually reachable. The unreachable are far fewer than anyone on either side will ever admit, because it ends the conflict. The conflict itself teaches us that the enemies are unreachable, and that's not true. And one of the things I've learned that blows me away about this is liberals are worse at this than conservatives. A study by Daniel Yudkin in 2019 found that Democrats with a graduate degree 3 times more likely to have an inaccurate perception of Republicans than Republicans who dropped out of high school are to have of Democrats. Let that sink in. Wow. It is our job as a congregation to be transformative. The most important transformation we can offer is to rehumanize people to each other. We do a lot of work rehumanizing when we uplift and uphold queer people, women, people of color, immigrants, religious freedom. If we can add rehumanizing those who disagree with us to that list, they might be transformed. We definitely will be. I really hope in this coming year, now that we know what our presidential election is going to be, more or less, that we work on this together here as a congregation. We can begin with just the other faith communities on our street. All of them are willing to participate, except maybe the Lutherans, and I don't know why. They won't answer emails, anything. But all the rest of them have met with the other clergy. There's a starting point. Maybe we'll even get the Lutherans in. We will not agree with our neighbors religiously or politically or socially, and that's the point. Our point is to be in contact as human beings with our neighbors, whoever they are. That's what we proclaim all the time, but we always mean accept Republicans and accept the MAGA hats and accept whoever's on the other horrible side of whatever conflict we have a side on. This is not easy stuff. I'm not asking you to attempt something simple. For me, it's difficult. I told you the story of where it took me. This is not easy. It's not simple. It is extraordinarily difficult, very hard, and requires a lot of intentionality in its planning and execution. But I have another lunch coming up with the clergy on the street. And on our agenda is creating some things that get our people together. Just to be together. Siding with love is great. And we are called to it in a far greater way than we usually think about. But siding in love only with those who love you back is easy. Even the worst of people in the world do that. Big religious teacher once talked about this a lot. What does that get us? Everybody does it. Loving those that are hard to love, or that for whatever reason we find hard to love, even if they're easy to love, that's what we're called to do. That's the most transformative journey we can be on. It really is incredibly difficult to hate another person face to face. It really is. Relationship building is key to community building. Community building is necessary for belonging. Belonging is a requirement of democracy that functions. At this moment in our country, I think the greatest community service we can render is to offer to teach people to rehumanize each other, to learn how to do it ourselves, to provide a time and a place to practice doing so and engage that practice. We live in a time of multiple acute crises: democracy, human rights, war, the environment. But the way to salvation, what's salvific, what's saving, right, of all of us, the way to salvation, saving democracy, human rights, the planet, is not defeating the other side. It's transforming the high conflict into a good conflict, the good conflict into belonging, belonging into beloved community, so we can offer peace to all who pass by. Check out my website and blog at tonylorenzen.com for even more resources that will open your mind, touch your heart, and inspire your spirit.